It's a great pleasure speaking with you today. Emorie, perhaps you'd just like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you've been doing in your career.
So my name is Emorie Beck. I am an assistant professor at the University of California, Davis in the psychology department. I am a personality psychologist by training. I did my PhD at Washington University in St. Louis and then went on to do a postdoc at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine. Broadly, I am interested in all things personality and individual differences. I think the core question that I'm really interested in is this question of what personality is, and how, whether we sort of recognize it or realize it or not, we actually are applying different operational and working definitions of personality all the time. So one thing that my lab and I are constantly trying to do in the work that we're doing is sort of recognize the ways in which each of these different definitions have consequences for how we should measure and model personality, as well as what this helps us to learn about personality, perhaps as an aggregated whole.
Why does this inspire you? Why are you interested in doing this?
So I actually got a rather unconventional start in personality psychology. So I think that, especially in the US, most people come to personality psychology because they take an introductory course, they get introduced, to the idea of personality traits and become really excited about having this sort of reliable and valid taxonomy of individual differences that predict long-term outcomes, show patterns of change, and so on. But I actually came at it from a much sort of, I guess, less common perspective, which is these sort of social cognitive approaches to personality. So I actually got my start sort of assuming that traits were actually not perhaps going to be the ideal sort of level at which we should understand an individual and even a population's personality. And instead, we should be looking at these much more contextualized patterns of dynamics within individuals' everyday life. And so I think that this is a really important question, because I think that these two perspectives have been talking sort of past each other for the last half century or so. And I think that we're at a really kind of pivotal moment in the field where the methods and the models that we have really caught up to sort of the questions that we have been long trying to ask and answer in personality about how do we understand one person? How do we understand differences across people? And I think perhaps most importantly, how do these differences across people maybe map on to how it is that personality functions within any given individual? And so this sort of tension between these differences across people and these processes that are unfolding over shorter timeframes within individuals has always really inspired me. It feels like it's a bit of a paradox to be able to think about these two levels simultaneously. And frankly, it's something that I continue to struggle with all of the time. But it also makes me really sort of hopeful for the future of personality and the ability to sort of pivot back to some of these sort of really basic questions about what personality is, how we model it, how it changes across time, and more throughout the course of my career and hopefully well long after I'm gone.
Do you see your work as providing a possible bridge between the social psychologists and the personality psychologists who seem not to have talked to each other for quite a long period of time now?
I think it definitely can be. I know that I've had some very generative conversations with social psychologists. The one question that they often want to ask me is whether or not I think that things like habits and goals and motivation sort of have a sort of like central role within personality. And with habits in particular, I think that habits are one of the really critical mechanisms that we need to be able to understand these stabilities that we see in things like personality traits over a longer period of time. But in sort of like response to some of the challenges coming out of things like the person situation debate, where personality really needed, and I say here needed, to establish itself as a science that could sort of operate with these traditional sort of like personality trait-based inferences that allow us to know these differences and how these map onto individual people. But coming out of the person situation debate, it was really important for personality psychologists to be able to establish that there are characteristics of the person that are reliable and valid in terms of predicting everything from everyday behaviors to these longer term outcomes. But I think that we're much, we're in a very different position now where we're able to actually look not just at these broad patterns of differences that are able to predict long-term outcomes, but to really start drilling into this question about why. So what are the actual underlying mechanisms that support why these things exist? And I think that kind of actually necessarily and naturally brings social and personality psychology back together, because we start recognizing that people's lives are unfolding in the context of their lives. We start recognizing that things like habits are going to be incredibly important, if not actually the mechanism that we think is really important if people want to change their personality trait levels, and so on and so forth. And so I do hope that some of the work that we're doing at least opens up sort of conversational lines between social and personality psychologists that could sort of, in this 21st century, bring these fields back together and bring psychology sort of as a more unified, integrated whole.
Fabulous, thanks. And now I was lucky enough to see your keynote talk at the ISSID conference in Vienna. Could you just give me a recap, please, about what you talked about? And I thought the audience was absolutely spellbound by it. So it was very interesting.
Well, thank you. So to give just a brief overview, so much like my research, my keynote started with this kind of basic question of, when we start thinking about, what we want to do in psychology, we want to be able to describe, predict, and explain the things that people think, feel, and do. And I think most challenging, we want to be able to do this not just for sort of like one single individual, although of course we do want to do that for one person, but also to be able to capture these differences across people. And fundamentally for me, that question, that challenge is this question of what personality is. It's hard for me, frankly, to think about psychology without thinking about it in terms of personality, which might be my training, or I think it might also sort of highlight the primacy of the person in answering psychological questions. But there's a big challenge in personality in sort of the definitions that we often use. So the most common definition that we have of personality is the characteristic patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving. And this functionally is a definition of personality traits. And traits have become so ubiquitous in personality that we think of personality as traits. We think of traits as causal, and so on and so forth. But that's always been a sort of overly simplistic explanation, at least for me, and especially whenever we think about doing this for one person. I think that if we want to understand the sort of, as Dan McAdams would say, texture and richness of the individual life, we necessarily need to have a sort of deeper understanding of them than their sort of rank ordering on a small set of parsimonious dimensions. And so what I then have sort of set out throughout my career to do is to figure out, is there a different or is there a complementary definition of personality that can better help us to understand the single case, that single individual? And is there a possibility through what we're calling bottom-up integration to use sort of this understanding of first one individual and then hopefully separately through iteration, many individuals to better capture what these psychological differences are? And my favorite definition, I think, actually is one of the oldest, which is Gordon Allport's definition, which is that personality is the dynamic organization within the individual of those psychophysical systems that determine his unique adjustments to the environment. And I love this definition because it centers the individual. It describes personality as a system and also implies that it's multivariate. I think people are multivariate. I think all of us have, multiple psychological processes unfolding. We have different interests. We have all of these things that make us who we are. And so then throughout the rest of my keynote, in a series of 3 broad studies that are sort of addressing different components of this, what I was doing is sort of like trying to lay out the case that I think that personality as a dynamic system has the possibility of integrating this thing that we're so afraid of, aka situations, and also being able to actually predict behavior, which has long been something that we've struggled to do within the field of psychology. So first, I talked about some of my sort of foundational research in which, in an experience sampling study repeated multiple times across 3 years, I actually looked at the idiographic personality networks, which we're sort of thinking of as a proxy for those person-specific or idiographic personality systems, and looked at whether or not people, one, differed from each other, and then 2, whether these were actually consistent across time. Because to actually sort of meet the definition of some of our other aspects of personality, namely that there should be some sort of characteristic pattern and some sort of stability, we would hope that these idiographic systems would demonstrate similar levels of stability to things like personality traits. In that study, we actually did find both that people do sort of reliably differ. They have these sort of different personality systems or structures or networks, and also that those were quite consistent across 2 years, on par with a profile of personality traits, if not actually a little bit higher. And we even went on and were able to replicate that in other samples. And then that study kind of led to this question of, okay, yes, but you're just looking at these sort of psychological characteristics and states and how these are unfolding across time. But how is it that obviously we think that these contexts, these sort of situations that people inhabit are also going to be impacting psychological functioning? And so in a second study that had just recently been published in Nature Human Behavior, I was reviewing some evidence from 5 longitudinal panel studies looking at the ways in which sort of the context of people's lives and how that impacts the way in which they actually feel satisfied in specific domains might be associated with their sort of general happiness or satisfaction with life across time. And we chose this sort of approach for a few different reasons, but a big one is that this study of well-being and life satisfaction has some pretty strong theories that have long been treated as competing, even if they're not perhaps as competing as we once thought. So one of these are these sort of ideas of top-down approaches to understanding life satisfaction. And the idea here is that I am someone who is generally satisfied with my life. Therefore, I put on my rose-colored glasses and I tend to then evaluate all of the domains of my life as quite positive. Even if things maybe aren't actually that great at work, I'm still going to sort of positively evaluate that domain of my life. The second is more situational. This would be a sort of more bottom-up approach. And the idea here is that I'm basically taking an aggregate of how satisfied I am in each of these specific domains of my life. And then that is what's actually sort of determining my overall levels of life satisfaction. So if things aren't going well at work or things aren't going well in a personal relationship, we would expect there to be some sort of dock on my sort of global life satisfaction. But more recently, people have sort of compromised, much as we have, I think, across many domains of psychological science, and instead said, actually, it's bidirectional. And so instead, we both have these patterns where the general way that I appraise my life impacts how I see specific domains. But also, if something isn't going well, then for most people, that's, well, frankly, the theory implies for all people, we're going to see some sort of impact on your global life satisfaction whenever you have something negative and or positive happen in those specific domains. But we really just wanted to take this very classical question and kind of flip it on its head. So instead of asking which of these theories is correct, is it bottom up? Is it top down? Is it bidirectional? From my sort of prior work and perspective, I was really curious if actually some of these theories were more true for some people than others. And so what we decided to do then was to use, again, some of these N=1 network models, as well as a multi-level variant of that, to be able to investigate whether or not people actually differ in the degree to which they demonstrated more top-down, bottom-up, or bidirectional associations between the domains of their life and the sort of global life satisfaction that they have. And we actually found pretty good evidence for that across, again, these 5 different longitudinal studies and more than 40,000 people. And the time period for each person spanned up to 20 years of time. And what this basically indicates for us is that this sort of, assumption that these situations or these contexts of people's lives should, 1, be similar, and 2, impact people similarly, is likely incorrect. And instead, when we think about, for example, trying to improve happiness and well-being, we need to be a little bit more attuned to the way in which this is unfolding within the individual life. There might be some people, for example, who really do have their happiness determined by how things are going in their life. Then for those people, we would hope that we're going to create interventions that are actually going to then maybe try to improve their work or try to improve their relationships. And we should see that that actually improves their lives. And on the flip of that, if someone is more sort of top down, doing that might have no impact on their global satisfaction. And for them, it might make a lot of more sense to try to change their perspective. So try to encourage them to engage in something like psychotherapy or other kinds of things that are meant to sort of shift that mindset, and then hope that that sort of bleeds or trickles down into the domains of their lives. And then we sort of took that study as, again, this sort of validation that this question about people might differ to the degree and in the ways in which these contexts and more person sort of perspective-like variables might be impacting, various psychological processes to bring that behavioral piece back in. And so in the third study that I presented, which was published a few years ago in Psychological Science, we were again asking a pretty simple question. And that is, rather than assuming that people with the same levels of a personality trait or people in the same situation should react similarly, maybe people actually do differentially respond to a situation regardless of their personality trait. And or people, with similar levels of a personality trait might react to situations very, very differently. And so in this study, what we did was we took an experience sampling study that was sort of optimized to be able to study people's loneliness and procrastination in everyday life. And we administered a bunch of these experience sampling surveys, capturing aspects of their psychological states, as well as the situation characteristics and cues that are giving us sort of information on that context. And what we did was for each person separately, we basically compared different models that included just these more sort of psychological processes, just these situational processes, or both, and looked at how well we were able to predict procrastination and loneliness for each of these individuals. And what this allowed us to do was, one, just test, can we actually predict these behaviors that have been largely elusive? And then two, do people differ in what is actually predictive of those? And what we found was that relative to previous investigations that had looked for sort of like a small subset of predictors that were most predictive for most people, when we did this from this more N=1 or idiographic perspective, we were actually able to increase the predictive accuracy by a pretty large margin. Second, we were able to see that people differed in what was actually most predictive of those behaviors and experiences. So for some people, it was pretty much just psychological features. For others, it was just situational features. But for most people, it was a varying mix of both situational and psychological features. And then we drilled down a little bit more into that, and we're able to actually demonstrate that even within those categories of things like psychological features versus situational features, people still differed quite a lot in which features were most predictive of their procrastination and loneliness. And I think that this is really important because it maps on to our sort of, I think, lay understanding of our own behaviors and experiences. When we think about why it is that we do something, and I do this exercise in my introductory personality class at the very beginning every time, I ask people to think about why it is they did something that they did earlier that day. And then try to think about, are those reasons more about internal states, more about the environment, or what is actually sort of determining that. And most of the students tend to provide somewhere north of 5 different reasons that they did something that tend to be a bit of a mix of these different kinds of explanations. And so I think that ultimately this is a pretty intuitive sort of representation of the way in which behaviors and experiences do unfold within and across people. And so took all of that to kind of just wrap up and make the case that when we're thinking about what it is that personality is, we can take these different definitions, but we shouldn't, as the kids would say, sleep on these more situational variables, as well as these more behavioral variables that allow us to actually contextualize and validate the research that we're doing. I think that the future of psychology, sort of broadly, and personality particularly, is going to be characterized by attention to these processes that are unfolding heterogeneously within the individual. And my lab is doing a lot of work in this space, everything from doing now personalized assessment to try to sort of broaden the scope and look at things like actual cognitive tests across time in everyday life, and answer these questions from just a variety of different ways.
That's an amazing answer to what I thought was a simple question, but you really gave a great contextualized and very interesting and informative answer. So thank you for that. Now, it seems to me that you've chosen the field, the dynamics of personality, looking at within and between person variants, as a field which is really becoming very central to personality psychology. What advice would you give to people coming into the field so that they could maybe follow you in your stellar career and also achieve the same kind of level of success?
I think that a lot of students that are coming in are I mean, I think fairly afraid. And again, I think this is a very fair response. It's really intimidating to come into a field where there's decades of research and people asking questions who you assume are much, much smarter than you, have much more experience than you. And maybe all of those things are true. But I think that as a science that studies individual people, we also need to recognize the importance of having a heterogeneous group of people who actually does our science. And so I hope that a lot of the junior folks who are entering the field recognize that they bring a distinct, diverse, and important perspective that has likely not been sort of captured in prior research that could help us to sort of, pivot, transition, revolutionize even the way that we think about what personality is, how we should study it, and more. I also think that, and this is something I try to impart to my students all of the time, no one knows what they're doing. That's sort of, in some ways, what science is. We're trying to come up with hypotheses. We're trying to figure out how we could possibly test those. We're trying to figure out the most effective way to evaluate those things. And the answer that we come up with now might not be the answer forever. Science is supposed to be self-correcting. And so just trying to think about these ways in which you don't need to be perfect now. What you need to do is start to try to make steps to broaden your knowledge, to broaden your skills, and see what kinds of things you might be interested in. And following that is likely going to lead you in a direction that can both set you up for success, but also hopefully not just success in a sort of professional way, but hopefully one that also leads to personal happiness and well-being.
Yes, I like to think that science is actually one of the greatest ways of spending your life playing, because that's what science is. It's playing around with ideas, playing around with things that might or might not be true. It's play. And that, I think, is why perhaps science is such a satisfying career to follow.
No, I love that. And I think that that's so true. If I always use the phrase in my lab, we're playing with ideas. We get to play with ideas, and that's our job. So I think that's a great advice for students of just reminding them that you get to play. You get to play with these ideas. You get to be like, I think this person who is really important was maybe wrong. And you're allowed to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Emorie, thank you so much for spending a short period of time with me today to celebrate you, your career, and also to thank you once again for your very informative and I think very well executed keynote talk at the last ISSID conference. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.